Carrying the weight. How does maternal depression shape a baby's stress biology? Now, have you ever wondered how a fetus, so a baby inside the womb, can be influenced by the world outside the womb? Perhaps you've heard that playing classical music to a baby before can enhance its intelligence. Maybe you've even tried this yourself. But what about emotions and the emotions of the mother and the mother's overall mental health? Could a pregnant woman's emotion leave a biological imprint on her baby before it's born? Well, in 2018, Dr. Osborne and other researchers at King's College London asked this very question when conducting their study. The study is really unique because it looks at women who have been clinically diagnosed with depression. What this means is that they have reached a threshold of diagnosis, not just symptoms or a mood. It explores how this depression affects the mothers and their babies, and it's looking at them over the course of a certain amount of time, measuring things such as their stress and their hormones and inflammation, and then the baby's early development. And by doing this, the research helps us to better understand the changes that happen during pregnancy and how they might shape a baby's health after birth. Now, why was this study needed? Lots of other studies have linked depression in pregnancy to stress-related changes in the babies, but these past studies and research were all looking at a separate piece of the puzzle. And in order to understand the full picture, you need to look at the whole puzzle. And this is what Dr. Osborne did. They connected all the pieces to look at that bigger picture. Again, focusing on mothers with a clinical diagnosis of depression, not just mood changes and symptoms. They measured how this affected their bodies through inflammation and stress hormones, and also how it affected the baby's development, connecting all these pieces together for the first time. Now, how did they put all of these pieces together? To do this, they followed 106 pregnant women. Some were diagnosed with major depressive disorder, MDD, and others were not. Now, they had to ensure that those who were had a clinical diagnosis, so they used something called the DSM, which is the gold standard of psychiatric diagnosis, to confirm this. They also looked at the mother's stress biology, so they can understand biologically what's going on. They used blood tests to look at inflammation and those markers. They used the saliva to measure the stress hormone cortisol. They also looked at the baby's outcomes. So they looked at the babies at 6 days, at 2 months, and at 12 months. And they looked at the assessments of the behavior of these babies and the stress response of these babies. And they used the cortisol after a immunization shot, actually before and after an immunization shot, as this is considered a stressful event. Now, I just want to take a moment and pause. I've been saying cortisol and inflammation, but what do they mean? And how do they relate to depression and stress? Now, inflammation we can think of like the body's fire alarm. If there's a real fire, like an injury or infection, the alarm goes off to call for help and alert the body to fight back. But if the alarm keeps ringing all the time, even when there's no fire, it can cause unnecessary damage. And with chronic stress and depression, the body's fire alarm stays on longer than it should. Now, in this study, the researchers used inflammatory markers, like checking how loud the alarm is ringing to see if stress in pregnancy is affecting the mother and its baby. They also looked at another thing called cortisol. We can think of this like the body's internal coffee machine. In the morning, it brews a strong cup of coffee to wake you up, but by night it slows down so you can rest. But with chronic stress or depression, this machine starts to error and malfunction. You're having too much coffee at the wrong time, so you're maybe anxious and wired, or it breaks down when you might need that coffee and that energy, so you feel exhausted. And in this study, researchers looked at cortisol and saliva, like checking how much stress coffee the body is brewing, to see how depression in pregnancy affects both mothers and its babies. Now, going back to the study, how are the authors really going to understand and measure all these different pieces? What do we do with that information? How can we understand it? And this is where something called statistical analysis comes in. We look at all the different patterns and connections in the data. They looked at the connection between a mother's biology and her baby's development. So instead of just looking at separate factors, statistical analysis can connect them together and see how these pieces fit together and whether certain biological changes in pregnancy are really linked to differences in the stress of a baby. When they've done this, what did they find? They found that women with depression during pregnancy had disrupted cortisol. They had increased inflammation, and their babies were born on average 8 days earlier than women who did not have depression during pregnancy. And the babies of women who had depression during pregnancy, after they received that immunization shot, they had higher levels of cortisol, so they had higher stress responses at 12 months. And this stress response was also linked to their mother's stress biology, so it was linked to that cortisol and inflammation. Another thing they found was some small differences in their baby's behavior at 6 days, but not at 12 months. Now, this is a lot of information. What does it all mean? The study is telling us that at a clinical level of depression during pregnancy, this can set the dial on a baby's stress system before they're even born. The body's fire alarm, so that inflammation, is staying switched on longer, impacting how a baby's stress system develops. The mother's coffee machine, cortisol, also brews at the wrong times, which may impact the baby's ability to handle stress later in life. Why do these results matter? They matter because mental health problems during pregnancy isn't just about emotions. It's linked to real biological changes that can shape a child's stress responses in the future. This study helps us understand how these pieces fit together, bringing us one step closer to supporting both mothers and babies before birth. However, there's a few things this study doesn't tell us. It's a step forward, but not the full picture. As some of the people in the study, the mothers, they may have had that depression before, and there may be some genetic implications, so different traits that were passed on. Also, the participants were all from London, so they might not be fully reflective of the general population, and you need more people to understand this better. And also, the types of statistical analyses that we used, we can't necessarily say why. We can say they're related, but we can't say necessarily this is caused by this. But some key takeaways that we can leave with is that understanding mental health is health. We need earlier treatments, and mental health disorders like depression are complex. They have lasting impacts, and earlier support for mothers is an investment in future generations.